The gavel came down like a death sentence, and the laughter that followed it was the cruelest sound Beatrice Ashborne had ever heard in her life. She stood at the back of the vampire court's grand chamber, soaking wet from the November rain that had chased her through the underground tunnels of Vienna's hidden city, her cheap sneakers squeaking against marble floors that had been polished for centuries. Around her, immortal beings in silk and velvet and ancient jewelry turned to look at the human girl who had forced her way past 3 layers of security, who had screamed at the guards that she had evidence, who had been dragged inside by nothing more than sheer desperation, and the fact that she had known the one blood law that even the guards could not legally ignore. Any witness bearing testimony relevant to a blood tribunal must be heard before the sentence is carried out. She had memorized that law. She had memorized every law she could find in the 6 days since she had run. The laughter came from a corner of the obsidian-walled chamber. Vampire nobles in their finery, creatures who had lived through the fall of empires, were laughing at her. The sound was musical and cold and utterly without mercy, and Beatrice let it wash over her like the rain had, because she had learned a very important thing in 22 years of surviving on her own. Being laughed at did not kill you. What killed you was giving up. At the front of the chamber, chained to a dais of black stone, in binding shackles that glowed with suppression sigils, Balthazar De Vries did not laugh. He did not look at her with hope either. His silver-white hair fell loose around his face, his pale skin marked with evidence of what he had already endured during questioning, and his dark violet eyes, the color of a storm at midnight, fixed on her with an expression she could not yet read. Disbelief, perhaps. Something furious and protective moving underneath it. She had seen that expression once before. The night all of this had begun, the vampire king, Aldrich Voss, sat upon a throne of obsidian and carved bone at the chamber's far end. Ancient beyond reckoning, his white hair swept back from a face that looked 35 and held the coldness of a glacier. Beside him, Queen Seraphel regarded Beatrice with gold-flecked eyes that were measuring and sharp. Around them, the full court of the Nocturne realm assembled in curved tiers, and at the prosecution table sat Lord Cassian Morn, the architect of everything Beatrice had come here to destroy. Cassian Morn, who was smiling at her right now, warm and welcoming, the smile of a man who was utterly certain he had already won. A human, Aldrich Voss said, his voice carrying the hall without effort, quieting every laugh like a hand pressed over a flame. You invoke the testimony right. I will grant you the floor, child, but understand this. If your testimony is found to be fabricated, or if you are acting as an agent of the condemned, you will be remanded into court custody indefinitely. Do you accept those terms? Beatrice's hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs and looked the vampire king directly in the eyes, which she had been told you should never do. I accept, she said, and I would like to begin. 6 days earlier, she had been a nobody. That was not false modesty. It was simply the architecture of her life. Beatrice Ashborne, 22, orphaned at 9, aged out of the foster system at 18. Currently employed as a file clerk at Morgenthau Legal Associates, a mid-tier firm in Vienna's human district that handled the administrative overflow of contracts between vampire and human businesses. She lived in a studio apartment above a bakery on Kestrelgasse. She owned 4 pairs of jeans. She read constantly. And she had exactly one friend, a woman named Dara, who worked the night shift at the all-hours pharmacy 2 streets over. She was not the kind of a person anything happened to, until the night she worked late to finish a filing backlog, and she found the document that was not supposed to exist. It had been misfiled, slipped between 2 legitimate contracts, a thin folder stamped with the Nocturne Court seal, and a red designation she had learned to recognize. Classified blood tribunal evidence. The documents inside should have been locked in the court's own archive. They had no business being in a human law firm's physical filing system, which meant someone had either panicked and hidden them here, or deliberately placed them where they could later be destroyed without leaving a trail through court records. Beatrice almost set the folder aside. She almost did exactly what a sensible, invisible, unimportant file clerk would have done. Instead, she read it. The documents were a forensic trail. Financial transfers, witness statements, a communication log. They told a story, and the story they told was damning, but not for the person the court had charged. The evidence pointed to the systematic framing of Balthazar De Vries, Crown Prince of the Nocturne realm, for the assassination of Ambassador Valdris Thorn, the vampire liaison, who had maintained the fragile peace between the northern and southern vampire territories for over a century. Thorn's death had nearly reignited a war. The court had moved swiftly to charge Balthazar, who had been found in Thousands, whose signet ring had been found on the body, whose entire violent history with Thorn was well documented in court records. The documents in Beatrice's hands told a completely different version of events. They showed that the financial transfers that funded the assassination had originated from accounts registered to Lord Cassian Morn. They showed witness statements that had been altered between their original recording and their submission to the tribunal. They showed a communication between Morn and a human operative 3 weeks before Thorn's death, planning the timing of a framing operation that required the prince's signet ring, which Morn had arranged to be stolen during a court function and returned the following morning before Balthazar noticed it missing. Beatrice sat in the empty office at 10 past midnight with this folder in her hands and understood with precise clarity that she was now in a great deal of danger. She also understood something else. A man was going to be executed for something he had not done, and the evidence proving that was sitting in her hands, and there was no one else in this building. The logical solutions were clear, and she considered them honestly. She could leave the documents for her employer to find in the morning, except her employer's senior partner was listed in the communication log as having received a payment from Morn. She could take the documents to the human police, except the blood tribunal operated under vampire law and human authorities had no jurisdiction. She could contact someone at the Nocturne Court itself, except the court had already received its evidence through Morn's controlled channels, and she had no way to know which court officials were compromised. She could also, and this was the option that terrified her most, do nothing at all. Tell herself it was not her problem, go home. Let the prince be executed for a murder he did not commit, because getting involved meant putting herself directly in the path of whatever Cassian Morn was willing to do to protect his secret, and he had already demonstrated he was willing to commission an assassination. She sat with that option for exactly 4 minutes. Then she photographed every page with her phone, tucked the original folder into her bag, and walked out of the office. She had 2 days before the tribunal's verdict was scheduled. 2 days to figure out how to get into a court that did not let humans inside its walls unless those humans were contracted workers, servants, or prisoners. She spent the first day learning the blood law of testimony. She spent the second day finding the underground entrance that the contracted supply workers used, a narrow maintenance tunnel that ran beneath the old quarter, accessible through a basement door that her employer's filing system, because they had handled the supply contracts, had listed with its access code. She spent the 6 hours before the tribunal learning how to pick the lock on the outer grille, because the access code had been changed and the filing records had not been updated. She also spent that time very thoroughly afraid, which she handled by making lists of everything she needed to say and the order she needed to say it in. The laughter when she appeared had been anticipated. She had prepared for it. What she had not prepared for was the way Balthazar De Vries looked at her. As she stood there dripping on ancient marble and met his eyes for the first time in person, something shifted in the air of the chamber. Not magic, nothing supernatural, just the weight of 2 people recognizing something in each other across an impossible distance. She turned away from him because she needed to focus, and she addressed the king. "Your Majesty," she said, and her voice held steady, which she considered a personal triumph. "My name is Beatrice Ashborne. I am a file clerk employed by Morgenthau Legal Associates, which handles contract administration for several Nocturne Court supply agreements. 6 days ago, I discovered documents in my employer's physical filing system that constitute material evidence relevant to this tribunal. I am prepared to present those documents and to give testimony regarding where I found them and the chain of custody I have maintained." "You are a file clerk," said Lord Cassian Morn from his seat at the prosecution table, his voice carrying infinite patience and a faint, generous amusement. "Miss Ashborne, I admire your courage in coming here, truly. But this tribunal has been in session for 3 weeks. Its evidence has been reviewed by court archivists, legal scholars, and 3 appointed judges. What could a human file clerk possibly contribute that 6 centuries of combined judicial experience has not already considered? More laughter, softer this time, appreciative of his delivery. Beatrice looked at Cassian Morn and felt the particular cold clarity she always felt when someone underestimated her. It was not anger. Anger was a flame that burned sideways and caught things you did not mean to burn. This was something much more useful. Lord Morn, she said pleasantly, I have documentation showing that your private accounts funded the assassination of Ambassador Thorn. I have the original, unaltered witness statements that were submitted to this tribunal in a modified form. And I have a communication log showing your coordination with a human operative named Pieter Vans 3 weeks before Ambassador Thorn's death, in which you discuss the specific details of the framing operation, including the theft and return of the Crown Prince's signet ring during the autumn court reception. The chamber went so quiet that Beatrice could hear the rain above ground, even through 40 feet of stone and the hum of suppression sigils. Cassian Morn's face did not move. He was very good, but his hands, resting on the prosecution table, pressed flat and still in a way that told her everything. At the dais, Balthazar De Vries had closed his eyes. Bring those documents forward, said King Aldrich Voss, and his voice had changed entirely. What followed were 4 hours that Beatrice would later describe to Dara as the most terrifying and exhilarating experience of her life, and Dara would look at her and say that was deeply concerning and also completely typical of you. The court archivists examined her photographs and then her originals. A sigil reader was summoned to verify the age and authenticity of the documents. The court's own forensic specialists were called to examine the financial records. An ancient blood law specialist was brought in to rule on the admissibility of evidence obtained by a human civilian. The admissibility ruling took the longest, because several court members argued strenuously that no evidence obtained by a human, who could not be bound by vampire truth oaths, should be valid in a blood tribunal. It was Queen Seraphel who silenced that argument in a voice so cool and precise it made the chamber feel smaller. The blood law of testimony does not specify the species of the witness, she said. It specifies the relevance of the testimony. If we begin dismissing relevant evidence on the basis of the witness's humanity, we have stopped having a court and started having a very expensive performance. We will hear the evidence. During those 4 hours, Beatrice sat in a chair that a guard brought for her, because she had been standing for 6 hours, and her legs had started to tremble, and she kept her expression neutral and her notes organized in her lap and tried very hard not to look at the man chained to the dais. She failed, eventually. He was looking at her, steadily and without expression, with those storm-violet eyes, and when she finally met his gaze directly, he did something she had not expected. He inclined his head, a small, precise movement, almost imperceptible. From a vampire prince chained in a suppression dais, awaiting execution, it was not gratitude exactly. It was something more formal than that, older than that. Recognition, the acknowledgement between equals. Beatrice looked away before the heat in her face became visible. The court's verdict took another 2 hours. Lord Cassian Morn was detained within the first 40 minutes, when the altered witness statements were compared against the originals, and the discrepancies were found to be extensive and systematic. He was escorted from the prosecution table by 4 guards with expressions that suggested this was being handled with unusual speed, and he said nothing as they took him. He walked with the composure of a man who was already calculating his next move, which told Beatrice that this was not over, not for him, but that it was no longer her problem to solve. When the binding shackles were removed from Balthazar De Vries's wrists and the suppression sigils faded, and he rose to his full height for the first time since Beatrice had entered the chamber, the room was utterly silent. He was tall. She had registered that from across the chamber, but standing was different. He was built with the particular physical authority of someone who had trained for centuries, broad across the shoulders, with the controlled stillness of a predator, though completely comfortable with what it was. His white hair fell past his shoulders, and his skin was ivory pale, and he looked, in the damaged court clothes and the aftermath of 3 weeks of tribunal proceedings, like a portrait of something dangerous and beautiful that had been taken off a castle wall and made to bleed. He walked down from the dais. He walked straight toward Beatrice. The court watched in silence as the crown prince of the Nocturne realm crossed the chamber and stopped in front of the human file clerk sitting in a borrowed chair. And the silence had a quality to it that she recognized from very bad moments in her life. The kind of silence that precedes something that cannot be taken back. He looked down at her. Up close, his eyes were extraordinary, not supernatural. Exactly, just the particular depth that came from centuries of watching everything and judging carefully what deserved a reaction. "You should have been afraid to come here," he said. His voice was low and precise, with an accent that carried traces of languages that no longer existed. "I was," Beatrice said. "I came anyway." Something moved in his expression, just for a moment. Then it was composed again, regal and unreadable. "What is your name?" "Beatrice Ashborne." "Beatrice Ashborne," he said, as though he was filing it somewhere that would not lose it. "You have placed yourself in considerable danger by doing this. Cassian Morn is not finished." "I know," she said. "I've been thinking about that." "Have you determined a course of action?" She looked at him steadily. "I was hoping that part might be a collaborative effort." For the first time since she had entered the chamber, the crown prince of the Nocturne realm smiled. It was brief and unexpected and transformed his face in a way that made the watching court draw an audible breath, and Beatrice felt it like a struck bell, a single clean note ringing through her sternum. "Come with me," he said, and offered his hand. She took it. His fingers were cool and strong, and the grip he used was not possessive. It was the grip of someone making a promise they intended to keep. The court parted for them, and Beatrice Ashborne walked out of the blood tribunal beside the man she had just saved, and did not look back. The safe house was 3 levels beneath the Nocturne Court's public areas, accessible through a passage that required Balthazar's blood signature to open. It was not modest, exactly. Nothing in the vampire world was modest, but it was private, which was different. A sitting room with deep chairs and a working fireplace and walls of books that had been accumulated over what looked like several decades. A small kitchen, because the suite was built to house human guests as well, which meant real food and not just blood supplies. Beatrice ate a sandwich that a silent, efficient court attendant brought without being asked, because she had not eaten since the previous evening and her body had started to make pointed comments about this. She ate at the small table in the kitchen, while Balthazar stood near the fireplace in the sitting room and spoke to his advisors in the low, precise manner of someone who had been managing crises for a very long time and did not need to raise his voice to be understood. She could hear fragments, the containment of Cassian Morn, the identification of his network within the court, the question of which other officials had been compromised and how extensively, the question of the human operative, Pieter Vans, who had presumably been Morn's instrument on the ground, and whose whereabouts were now unknown. That last part made the back of Beatrice's neck prickle, because Pieter Vans knew the assassination had been staged. He also knew, presumably, that the staging documents had been misfiled, and it was possible he had already been sent to retrieve them from Morgenthau Legal Associates and discovered they were gone. Which meant he might know someone had taken them. Which meant he might have started asking questions about who had been in that office. She finished her sandwich. Then she went to the doorway of the sitting room. "The human operative," she said, not loudly, but clearly enough to cut through the advisor's discussion. "Pieter Vans. He may already know the documents were removed from the law firm. If he does, it would not be difficult to determine that I took them. I am the only one who was in the office that night." Balthazar dismissed his advisors with a single gesture. They filed out through a side door, and then it was just the two of them and the fireplace, and the particular intimacy of a crisis shared. "I have already considered this," he said. "I assumed you had. I just wanted to make sure we were in agreement that my apartment on Kestrelgas is not currently a safe place for me to be." "Your apartment," he said, "your place of employment, and anywhere within 3 blocks of either." He paused. "You will remain here." Beatrice raised an eyebrow. "That was not a question?" "No," he agreed without apology. "It was not." He looked at her with those direct, storm-violet eyes. "I am aware that you are not a person who takes instruction without explanation, so I will explain. Cassian Morn's network extends into the human district. He has used human intermediaries for exactly the reason that human intermediaries are harder to track through court surveillance, because our sigil readers are calibrated for vampire signatures. Peter Vans is one of at least four human operatives we have now identified in his network. If any one of them determines that you are the person who took those documents, they will not need court authorization to act against you, because you are human and you have no court protection. Unless, Beatrice said, slowly. I am under court protection. Yes, Balthazar said. Unless that. She considered him. You can grant that? My father can. He will when I ask him. But the granting takes 12 hours to formally register in the court's protection registry, which means tonight is the critical window. He studied her with that unnerving steadiness. Which is why you are staying here. Beatrice sat down in one of the deep chairs. The fire was warm, and she was exhausted in a way that went all the way through her. And she felt sitting there the first loosening of the adrenaline that had been holding her together for 6 days. I need to let my friend Dara know I'm all right, she said. She'll be worried. A message can be sent through secure channels. She doesn't have a court communication account. She has a phone number. Yes. Then a message can still be sent through secure channels. Our people can route it through a clean signal. He paused. Give me the number. She did. He sent it to someone through a device she couldn't see him pull from anywhere, which she suspected was a very expensive vampire equivalent of a smartphone. What did you send her? Beatrice asked. That you are safe and cannot return home for a few days, and will explain everything when you can. She's going to have approximately 900 questions. I imagine so. He sat down across from her, and the quality of his stillness changed. He was not working anymore. He was simply present in the room, with her. You read all of those documents in one sitting? Yes, and you understood their implications immediately. The financial transfers took me a few minutes to decode. The structure was deliberately complex. But yes. Once I understood the transfer pattern, the rest of it followed logically. He was watching her with an expression she was beginning to recognize. Not quite disbelief, and not quite admiration, and something that was its own thing entirely. What made you decide to come forward? He asked. The legally defensible choice would have been to alert your employer, or to leave the documents where they were and report their existence through official channels. My employer is listed in the communication log as a recipient of funds from Morn. You read that and acted on it immediately. I read it and understood that the official channels in this specific situation were compromised, so I had to find an unofficial one. You invoked a blood law that most court-trained officials don't have memorized. I found it in the public record. The Nocturne realm's foundational laws are digitized. Most humans don't read them because they assume they won't apply to them. He was quiet for a moment. Most wouldn't be wrong. Most would. The blood laws apply to anyone who invokes them correctly, regardless of species. The testimony right is one of 3 that explicitly do not specify the species of the invoker. I checked all 3. I used the most relevant one. He looked at her for a long moment. The fire shifted, throwing light across the angles of his face, and she noticed the marks from the tribunal proceedings more clearly in the warmer light. He had been treated carefully. The court was not barbaric in its procedures, but 3 weeks of confinement in suppression shackles left evidence of its own kind. That must have hurt, she said, before she could decide whether to say it. He glanced at his wrists. The sigil marks from the shackles had already begun to fade because vampire healing was rapid, but they had not faded entirely. I have endured worse, he said, which was probably both true and not the point. That wasn't a question about your pain tolerance, Beatrice said. It was an observation about what you went through. He looked at her again. Something shifted in his expression, fractional and contained, but she was getting better at reading the small things. Yes, he said quietly. It hurt. She nodded. She did not offer platitudes. She suspected he would find them condescending, and she would have been right. Get some rest, he said. The court physician will come in the morning. You should have your blood pressure checked. You have been operating on stress chemistry for nearly a week. You noticed that. Your hands were shaking when you entered the chamber. You controlled them within 30 seconds. You ate your meal in precisely the way someone eats when they are prioritizing fuel over experience. These are the behaviors of someone who has been in sustained high alert for days. He paused. You are better at concealing it than most, but the indicators are there for those who know what to look for. Beatrice stared at him. You are remarkably observant. I am several centuries old, and I trained under a war general, he said, with something that might, in a different man, have been called dry humor. Yes, remarkably observant. She laughed, short and surprised, and his expression shifted again, that fractional change, warmer this time. Good night, Beatrice Ashborne, he said. Good night, she said, and let him show her to the guest room, and lay down on a bed far more comfortable than her own, and was asleep within minutes. The next 3 days were a negotiation between proximity and the particular tension that builds between two people who are very aware of each other and doing nothing about it. Balthazar's people moved efficiently. Peter Vans was located within the first 89 hours, attempting to leave Vienna through a private transport service, and was taken into court custody without incident. The 3 other human operatives in Morn's network were identified through Vans's communication records and detained in cooperation with human law enforcement, which the court facilitated through a quiet, formal request that apparently bypassed most of the usual jurisdictional friction because the king had signed the request himself. Beatrice's court protection was registered within the 12-hour window. It was a formal designation, court-stamped and blood law binding, which meant that any act of aggression against her was now an act against the Nocturne Court itself. Balthazar explained this to her with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone delivering useful information, and she recognized, because she was paying attention, that he had petitioned his father for the highest available protection tier rather than the standard one. She did not mention that she had noticed this, but she filed it. During those 3 days they talked. This was perhaps the most unexpected development of all the unexpected things that had happened in the past week. They talked about the blood laws, which she had studied and he had lived inside of since his birth, and they found the interesting space between theoretical and lived knowledge where neither of them held all the advantages. They talked about the ambassador's assassination and the political landscape of the Northern Territories and what Cassian Morn had stood to gain from reigniting that conflict, which was a great deal, as Morn controlled shipping routes through the contested corridor, and a territorial war would have allowed him to consolidate those routes under emergency court provisions. They talked about books. This was the discovery that surprised Beatrice most. Balthazar De Vries, crown prince of the Nocturne realm, dangerous and regal, and possessed of an authority so natural it seemed to rearrange the air around him, was a reader with strong opinions about narrative structure and a particular fondness for mid-century detective fiction, which he claimed to appreciate for the logical architecture, even though Beatrice suspected there was also some element of comfort in a genre where everything was eventually explained and resolved. She told him this. He looked at her for a very long moment and then said, "That is an uncomfortably accurate analysis," in a tone that was not entirely comfortable. She also told him about herself, in the way that happens when two people are sharing a crisis, and the barriers that usually take years to erode simply are not there. She told him about being 9 and sitting in a social worker's office and understanding, with the particular clarity that children develop when they cannot afford to be wrong, that the people who were supposed to protect her were not coming. She told him about the foster system and what it had taught her, which was that institutions would fail you reliably, that you had to know the rules better than the people enforcing them, and that self-reliance was not a character trait so much as a survival technology. He listened the way people rarely listen, completely without formulating a response while she was still speaking. "You were 9 years old and you taught yourself not to need rescue," he said when she finished. "I taught myself to be capable of rescuing myself when needed. That's different. Is it?" She thought about it honestly. "Sometimes," she said. "Not always." He was quiet for a moment. Outside the windows of the safe house, she could hear the sounds of the underground city going about its business, the particular ambient noise of a community that never slept. "I was 312 when my mother died," he said, unexpectedly. "I had known for a century that it was coming. Vampire mortality operates differently, but it is not absent. There are illnesses that take even us, slowly over decades. I watched her decline and I used every resource available to me, and I could not stop it. He paused. I spent the following century being very certain that sufficient power and sufficient preparation could prevent loss. That control was the answer to helplessness. Did that work? Beatrice asked gently. No, he said. Control is not the same as prevention. It took me another century to learn that. His eyes met hers. What I eventually learned was that the appropriate response to helplessness is not control, it is trust. Choosing, deliberately, to trust that the people around you will be what they claim to be. That's a vulnerable position for someone like you, she said. Yes, he agreed, which is presumably why it took me 2 centuries to arrive at it. Another pause. And then someone I had never met walked into my execution chamber and trusted that doing the right thing was worth the risk. Beatrice felt warmth move up from her chest. She kept her voice level. I'm a file clerk. I made a professional judgment call about document integrity. He looked at her. Beatrice, yes, you are the least convincing person I have ever met when you are pretending to be smaller than you are. She looked at him for a long moment. The fire was between them and the books, and 3 days of shared space and crisis, and the slow, undeniable accumulation of knowing someone. You are also, she said finally, considerably more interesting than I expected from someone described in court documents as the terror of the Northern Campaign. His expression shifted in that way it did. That fractional warming that she had come to understand was not fractional at all, but was simply the way he expressed things that mattered to him. That title was earned in specific military circumstances. I believe you, she said. I also believe that the person who made sure the court physician checked on me twice yesterday and had someone route a second message to Dara to let her know I was actually fine, and not just fine, in the way someone says when they're being held against their will, is a very different kind of person than the terror of the Northern Campaign. Silence, warm and held. I wanted to make sure you were all right, he said simply. I know, she said, that's the point I'm making. He reached across the small distance between their chairs and, very slowly, very deliberately, took her hand. His fingers were cool and certain, and he held her hand with the careful intentionality of someone who understood the weight of what they were doing and had chosen it anyway. This is, he said, considerably complicated. Yes, Beatrice agreed, looking at their joined hands. It is. She looked up at him. I find I don't mind. Nor do I, he said, which I did not expect. Is that a problem? He considered her with great seriousness. A human and a vampire prince, with a court full of people waiting to have opinions about it, in the middle of a political crisis, with a formal protection designation that is going to raise questions the moment it is made public. He paused. Yes, it is objectively a significant problem. But, she prompted, but you walked into my execution chamber, with evidence in your bag and rain in your hair, and you quoted blood law at my father without trembling. He held her gaze. I think I am capable of managing the political complications. Beatrice smiled, not the controlled, professional expression she had learned to use. The real one that came from somewhere deeper than managed presentation. I think, she said, you might be. The political complications has arrived faster than either of them had entirely prepared, for though Balthazar, Beatrice noted, had prepared considerably, the tribunal's findings were formally announced on the 4th day. The charges against Crown Prince Balthazar De Vries were dismissed in their entirety, with the court's formal acknowledgement that the evidence against him had been fabricated. Lord Cassian Morn was charged under 6 separate blood laws, including conspiracy to commit assassination, evidence falsification, and corruption of judicial proceedings. Pieter Vans and the 3 other human operatives were transferred to human legal jurisdiction on related charges. The court's formal announcement included something Beatrice had not been warned about. A paragraph near the end identified the evidence as having been obtained and preserved by one Beatrice Ashborne, a human civilian, and noted that her court protection designation had been granted at the Crown Prince's petition and ratified by the King. The reaction in the court was significant. The reaction in the human district of Vienna was significant in a different way, because it was the first time in living memory that a human civilian had been formally acknowledged in a blood tribunal finding. and the community newspapers and blogs that covered the vampire-human interface zone ran the story with breathless intensity. The vampire court's internal reaction was more complicated. There were those who found the human woman's involvement distasteful, not because she had done anything wrong, but because the involvement of a human in internal court proceedings felt, to some, like a vulnerability. There were those who were deeply curious. There were those, particularly among the older families, who were concerned about what the Crown Prince's protection petition implied about the nature of his relationship with her. Court advisor Valthari, a woman who had served the Nocturne realm for 400 years, and possessed opinions she shared with the economy of a surgeon using a blade, requested a meeting with Balthazar on the 5th day. Beatrice heard about this afterward, because Balthazar told her. She wanted to know your intentions regarding Miss Ashborne, Beatrice said. She wanted to know my intentions, Balthazar said. Yes, what did you say? He looked at her with his direct, unequivocal gaze. I said that Miss Ashborne had saved my life and my name, and that I considered her under my personal protection as well as the court's, and that if anyone in this court had difficulty accepting the terms of that protection, they could direct their concerns to me personally. Beatrice processed this. That is either very clear or very unclear, depending on what you meant by personal protection. I meant, he said carefully, that I intend to be in your life, in whatever form makes sense between a human woman and a vampire prince, for as long as you will permit it. He paused. That is what I meant. She looked at him for a moment, then, Balthazar, he waited. You are going to have to be somewhat less formal about this, she said gently. If that is what you mean, then say that. Something moved in his expression, a loosening, almost imperceptible. I would like, he said more quietly, to know you, fully, as something other than my rescuer and something more than a ward under protection. He met her eyes. I would like for you to have reasons to stay that are yours, not obligations imposed by crisis. Those are not mutually exclusive with each other, she said. The crisis is how we met. That does not make what came after it manufactured. No, he agreed. It does not. She stood up from her chair and closed the distance between them and took his face in her hands, because he was clearly not going to do this first, and she was 22 years old and had survived too much to be patient about things she actually wanted. His expression shifted, open, and a little startled, which was wonderful on a face that had spent several centuries being unreadable. I am not going to need you to rescue me, she said, and I am not going to rescue you again, unless circumstances require it. What I would like is to simply know you, as you said. She held his gaze. Can we start there? He reached up and covered her hands with his, and his cool fingers were warm with intent. Yes, he said, we can start there. He kissed her, and it was careful and certain and unhurried in the way of someone who has learned that good things are worth approaching with full attention, and Beatrice felt the last 6 days settle into something that made sense. Not despite everything that had happened, but because of it. The weeks that followed were not without difficulty. The political landscape of the court shifted continuously as Cassian Morn's network was dismantled and the full extent of his corruption was mapped. There were 3 court members implicated in the conspiracy who resigned their positions. There was a formal hearing regarding the integrity of the evidence submission process that took 2 weeks and resulted in significant procedural changes. There was a territorial dispute in the north that had been indirectly destabilized by Thorne's death and required careful diplomatic work to prevent from escalating. Balthazar worked through all of it with the focused, controlled competence of someone who had been prepared since birth for the weight of governance, and who had decided at some point in those 3 weeks, in the suppression shackles, that the weight was worth carrying. Beatrice watched him work and understood the more she understood him, that the fierceness he applied to the things he cared about was not performance or pride. It was just how he functioned, all the way in, all the way committed, holding the thing he had chosen with both hands. She stayed in the court's residential wing, in rooms that had been made comfortable, with a degree of careful attention she found touching. Books she had mentioned in passing showed up on the shelves. The kitchen was stocked with the specific things she actually ate rather than a generic selection. A workspace was set up with the right equipment and access to the court library, which was more comprehensive than any academic archive she had ever worked with, because 6 centuries of accumulated documents were maintained by archivists who understood the blood law implications of every page. She worked. This was important to her, and Balthazar understood it without requiring explanation. She began working with the court's document systems, initially under an informal arrangement, and then, as the court's administrative office recognized what she was capable of, under a formal contract that paid her at a rate considerably more comfortable than Morgenthau Legal Associates. She was not doing this to stay near Balthazar. Though staying near Balthazar was something she was very willing to do, she was doing it because the work was important, because the blood laws were genuinely complex and consequential, and because someone who could read them clearly, and without the distortions of political alignment or species loyalty, was apparently quite useful. She also continued to read. Balthazar's library extended into parts of the court's collection that were not generally accessible, and she worked her way through them with the focused appetite of someone who had been hungry for this kind of depth her entire life. They discussed what she read. These conversations, which happened in the evenings when the day's work was done, became something she moved through, each day looking forward to, not as a destination exactly, but as a compass bearing. He came to find her one evening, 3 weeks after the tribunal, while she was deep in a 15th century blood law commentary that had a direct bearing on a jurisdictional question she was drafting a brief about. She heard him come in, and she held up one finger without looking up, because she was finishing a critical passage, and he sat down in the chair across from her desk and waited. She looked up 5 minutes later. He was watching her with an expression she recognized now, that particular quality of warmth beneath the composure, the thing he did not bother to conceal around her anymore. "Sorry," she said. "I needed to finish the passage." "Do not apologize," he said. "I find it extraordinarily comfortable to sit in a room where someone is working and does not feel the need to perform their awareness of my presence." She considered him. "That is probably a problem you've had for a long time." "Since approximately my 250th year," he confirmed. "The expectations of a crown do not leave much room for being simply a person in a room." "You are a person in a room," she said. "I know," he said. "You are one of very few people who have ever treated me as such." He paused. "My mother did. A general I served under for a century before he was killed in the northern campaigns, and now you." The weight of that was considerable, and she held it carefully. "I'm glad," she said, "that I do." "So am I," he leaned forward slightly. "Beatrice, there is something I want to say." She set down her pen. His tone had shifted, not heavy exactly, but intentional in a different way. "My father has asked me, formally, what my intentions are regarding your position at court." He held her gaze steadily. He is not objecting. He is asking because if my intentions are what he believes them to be, there are formal processes and designations that apply, and he would prefer to have the paperwork in order. Beatrice blinked. "Your father is concerned about the paperwork. He has been managing a court for 6 centuries. He is always concerned about the paperwork." A small, genuine smile. "But the paperwork exists because what it pertains to matters, and what I told him when he asked is that my intentions are to ask you to stay, not as a ward, not as a court employee, though you are very good at the work, as someone who is mine and who I am." He paused. "If that is a thing you could want. I am aware that what I am offers you a very unusual life. I am aware that there are things that are complicated. I am not asking you to decide any of the complicated things right now. I am asking you to tell me whether the direction is one you can move toward." Beatrice looked at him for a moment. She thought about the girl who had sat in a social worker's office at 9 years old and learned not to need rescue. She thought about the file clerk who had taught herself blood law in a crisis and walked into an execution chamber alone. She thought about what it meant that she had never been the kind of person who did things by halves, that when she committed to something, she committed entirely, and had learned that this was not a weakness. "You are asking me," she said, "whether I can see a future here." "Yes," he said simply. "With you, yes." She stood up from her desk and went to him, and he stood as she came, which was a reflex he had given up, pretending he could suppress. She put her hand against his chest, above his heart that beat slowly and steadily in the way of his kind, ancient and certain. I am not the kind of person who is afraid of unusual, she said. I am the kind of person who reads into the instructions, identifies the obstacles, and determines a workable path forward. She looked up at him. I have been determining a workable path forward since approximately 3 minutes after I first looked at you across that chamber. 3 minutes, he said, with that almost smile. It took you 3 minutes. 2 minutes and 40 seconds, if I am being precise. She held his gaze. Yes, Balthazar, the direction is one I can move toward. He kissed her with the unhurried certainty that was completely his, and she felt in it everything she had understood about him in the past weeks. The depth of what he felt that he had spent centuries learning to hold carefully because he knew its weight. The protectiveness that was not possessive. The dignity that made room for her without requiring her to diminish. The way he held her like she was important, not fragile, which was the distinction that had always mattered most to her. The formal court designation that Balthazar's father's paperwork had apparently been preparing for was not a small thing. The designation of consular companion, which was the court's term for the designated partner of a royal in a cross-species pairing, came with blood law protections so comprehensive that Cassian Morn's remaining allies, the ones who had been watching from the edges and considering whether a human woman in the prince's life was a vulnerability to exploit, promptly reconsidered. The protections were centuries old, originating in a period when vampire-human alliances had been politically essential, and they were not symbolic. Beatrice read every word of the designation documentation. She made 3 suggestions for clarification on ambiguous clauses. The king's senior archivist incorporated 2 of them, which was apparently unprecedented, and which the archivist communicated to her with the expression of someone who was not certain whether to be impressed or alarmed, and had settled on both simultaneously. Dara, who Beatrice finally called directly once the secure communication infrastructure was established, was silent for a very long time on the phone. Then she said, "So you found a folder, and then you broke into a vampire court, and now you are living in a vampire court, and you are romantically involved with a vampire prince." "That is an accurate summary, yes," Beatrice said. "Is he kind to you?" "Yes," Beatrice said, and felt the truth of it move through her simply and completely. "Is he the kind that means it, or the kind that is performance?" "The kind that means it. He is also occasionally extremely authoritative and convinced that his instincts about safety are absolutely correct." "Are they?" Beatrice thought about Peter Varnes, located and contained before he could act. The protection designation registered before the critical window closed the court physician twice in one day. "Usually," she admitted. "I want to meet him," Dara said. "I will arrange it. When? Give me a week." The paperwork for a court visitor designation is apparently also significant. Dara laughed, and it was the laugh of someone who was genuinely happy, and Beatrice held her phone and felt the warmth of being known, of having someone who understood her enough to ask the right questions. The months that followed were full, not in the breathless, survival-urgent way the first days had been, but in the way of a life that has found its proper shape and is filling it. There was work, serious and impotent, and the kind she had always wanted without knowing what form it would take. There was the court, which was a world entire unto itself, with its politics and its centuries of accumulated history, and its particular beauty that she was still discovering in new corners. There was Balthazar, who came to find her when the work was finished, who stood in doorways with his ancient patience and waited for her to reach a stopping point, who had opinions about everything and stated them directly and expected her to state her own and did not flinch when they disagreed, who was, in the private hours, in the mornings when the court was quiet and they had tea at the kitchen table like ordinary people, something close to gentle in a way she understood he had not been in the habit of being. Not gentle in the sense of softness, gentle in the sense of care, in the sense of choosing deliberately to put the armor down. She watched him in those moments and felt the particular kind of love that does not arrive in a single revelatory instant but accumulates, quietly and absolutely, through the evidence of what someone actually is, through the way he handled difficulty without theater, through the way he spoke about his mother, still after centuries, with a grief that had become part of him, rather than something he had decided to be done with. through the way he looked at her when he thought she was not looking back. With an expression so unguarded, she sometimes had to look away first. One evening, sitting on the stone balcony that looked over the underground city, with its 1,000 lights reflecting off a canal that had been built 3 centuries ago and maintained by people who took the long view of infrastructure, she told him what she was thinking. "I did not know," she said, "what I was building toward when I left the foster system at 18. I knew I was going to build something. I have always known that, but I did not know what it was." He was sitting beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched, looking out over the lights. "And now?" he asked. "Now, I think it was this," she said. "Not specifically. Not the vampire court or the blood tribunal or any of the particular geography, but this. A life that is mine that I built entirely. Work that matters. A person who sees me accurately and chooses me anyway." He turned to look at her. "I see you," he said, "very accurately, and I choose you completely." He paused. "I have not said that directly before." "I know," she said. "You have been saying it in other ways. I know that you have noticed. You notice everything." His voice was low and certain. "But I want to say it directly, because you taught me, without meaning to, that direct speech is a form of respect. That not making someone work to decode what you mean is a way of honoring them." Beatrice looked at him, this ancient, formidable, extraordinary man who had spent 600 years navigating the weight of dynasty and crown and loss and pride, and who had learned, from a 22-year-old file clerk who had shown up to his execution, dripping wet and quoting law at his father, that putting something plainly could be its own kind of courage. "I love you," she said. Because it was true, and he deserved to hear it directly, his breath shifted, almost imperceptibly, but she was very good at reading the small things. "I love you," he said, with the quiet, absolute conviction of someone who has taken a very long time to be certain and is certain now entirely. She leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and they sat with the lights of the underground city below them, and the weight of everything that had been, and the openness of everything that was coming. And neither of them felt the need to speak for a long time. The formal Morn trial, when it concluded 4 months after the tribunal, resulted in the most significant sentencing the Nocturne Court had handed down in over 100 years. Cassian Morn's sentence was permanent exile from the Nocturne realm, with full seizure of his assets and the stripping of his court titles. In vampire terms, this was understood to be a punishment more severe than any short sentence could have achieved. Because Morn was a creature who understood himself entirely through his court standing, and to be removed from that permanently was a particular kind of ending. Beatrice sat in the public gallery for the sentencing, beside Balthazar, in a seat that carried its own formal designation. She watched Cassian Morn receive his sentence with the composure of a man determined to give nothing away, and she felt no particular vindication in it. Vindication was for when you were uncertain you had been right. She had never been uncertain. After the sentencing, as they left the chamber, Balthazar took her hand in a way that was visible to the entire court gallery, unhurried and deliberate, and she felt the ripple of awareness move through the assembled nobility around them. She did not look away from it. She held his hand and walked beside him, with her spine straight and her head up, the way she had learned to carry herself at 9 years old in a social worker's office. And she felt him note this, felt the slight tightening of his fingers that said he had seen it and he understood it, and he was proud of her in a way that she suspected he would express later, privately and precisely. She was right about that. He did. The spring came to Vienna above ground, not something immediately visible from the underground city, but perceptible in the quality of the air and the behavior of the humans who moved through the interface zones, lighter-footed, and more willing to stay outdoors at the late hours when the two communities overlapped. Beatrice began making trips above ground regularly because she needed daylight in the way that humans do, and because the city was beautiful in the spring, and because Balthazar, who could not accompany her in the early afternoon hours without serious protective measures, had organized those measures with characteristic thoroughness. He wore a daylight ring when they went above ground together, an artifact of considerable value that the court kept in reserve for exactly this kind of necessity. It was not a comfortable experience for him, she knew. The ring suppressed the worst effects of sunlight, but not all of them. and she noticed the subtle signs of strain if they stayed above ground too long. She learned his limits and worked within them without making a project of it. The same way he worked around the things that were specific to her without requiring her to be different than she was. This was, she thought, what it actually looked like when it worked. Not the absence of difference, but the management of it, carefully and without resentment. Because the person on the other side of the difference was worth the management. They'd walk through the inner Stadt in the late afternoons when the light was softening, through streets that had been here for hundreds of years and had seen everything, and she told him things she saw that he might miss, small human things, the way the light hit the cafe windows, the sound a street musician made who had found exactly the right spot for his acoustics. He told her things she could not have noticed, the age of buildings by their energetic signatures, the particular markers in the city's architecture that showed the hidden influence of vampire planning in the human city's development over centuries. They were building something, not quickly, because he was not quick by nature, and she had learned that the things she built carefully lasted longer than the things she built in haste. They were building a life that made sense between their two natures, that honored what each of them was, that did not require either of them to be less than they were. One afternoon, sitting in a courtyard cafe with the April sun warm on her face, and his presence across the small table, steady and cool and completely itself, Beatrice thought about the girl who had stood dripping wet in a vampire execution chamber 6 months ago, and laughed at by an entire court of immortal beings. She thought about what she had said then, to herself, in the 3 seconds before she opened her mouth and spoke to the king. She had said, "Being laughed at does not kill you. What kills you is giving up." She had not given up. She had not given up, and she had proved a vampire prince innocent, and she had built herself from the materials of a difficult life and a very good mind, and the accidental grace of finding the right folder in the right filing cabinet, into someone who sat in a courtyard in Vienna with the love of her life across the table, a life of meaningful work ahead of her, and the utter settled certainty of someone who knows, not by luck but by effort, exactly where she belongs. "You are thinking very loudly," Balthazar said. "I am thinking quietly. You are listening very closely. You have a face when you are solving something," he said. "Even when what you are solving is not a problem." "What kind of face?" "The kind that means you have reached a conclusion." He met her eyes. "Have you?" "Several," she said. "Would you like them in order of significance, or in the order they occurred to me?" "Order of significance," he said, with that contained almost smile she had come to love with unreasonable specificity. "All right," she said. She looked at him across the small cafe table in the April sunlight, in the beautiful, complicated, layered city that was now her home. "The most significant conclusion is that I am very glad I read that folder, and that I am very glad I did not put it back." He looked at her for a moment. Then he reached across the table and covered her hand with his, cool and certain and completely present. "So am I," he said. Every day, above them the city went on in all its ordinary, extraordinary life, and the sunlight was warm. And the street musician 2 corners away was playing something that carried clearly in the spring air, and they stayed there as long as the light allowed, and then they went home together, to the underground city with its 1,000 lights and its ancient laws and its long memory, to the life they were building in the only way that lasts, which is one day at a time, deliberately and with both hands. That evening, in the comfortable sitting room with the fire and the books, Beatrice looked up from her work and found Balthazar's watching her with the expression she knew best and loved most, that quality of warmth beneath the composure that was entirely hers, that he had stopped concealing because she had stopped giving him reasons to. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Everything." A pause. "I was thinking that I spent 3 weeks in suppression shackles, waiting to be executed for something I did not do. And I was thinking that the reason I am sitting here instead is because of a human file clerk who read a folder that was misfiled and decided that mattered." "It did matter," she said. "Yes," he agreed, "it did, enormously." He held her gaze, steady and certain and 600 years deep. "You matter, enormously." Beatrice put down her pen. She looked at the man across the fire, from her, this ancient, complicated, fierce, quietly tender man who had chosen her as deliberately as she had chosen him, with full knowledge of what the choice meant and complete conviction that it was right. "I know," she said, and smiled at him. "So do you." Outside, Vienna moved through its night, human and vampire, ancient and new, ordinary and impossible, all of it together and all of it real. And inside, in the warm room with the books and the fire, two people who had found each other at the most unlikely possible intersection of crisis and courage, settled into the evening as naturally as breathing. And the life they were building together grew another day older and another day stronger, as all good things do.